Hi everyone. Thank you all for that introduction. The love is entirely mutual. What I was hoping we would do is for me to start off sharing this story of one community story of waging a social change campaign. And through that story, I hope to really use it to demonstrate some perspective and some lessons learned. And throughout, I also want to share a little bit about my coming out story. That is my coming out story as a campaign person. And I say that jokingly, but it was a real process for me to get to a place where I was understanding what campaigns were and how to think about them and what purpose they served. And so I want to try to also offer you some insight into the shifts in mindset that I've had over the last couple of years in that journey. And then I really hope that we together can have a conversation about some of the practical challenges and the relationships between campaigns and movement building. So I would love to keep this informal. Please interrupt me. Feel free to interrupt with questions or comments or challenges to these ideas. I really welcome that. And I'm going to tell this story in a series of snapshots. This story is very long. It takes place over many years. And in order to help you move through time and space with me, I'm using some visuals and some pictures so we can go through this journey together. Sound good? Good? Okay. So, so most of this story, as you will guess, happens in Maine, and the community there chose to wage a campaign focused on marriage equality. But I actually want to start this story many miles away and many years earlier in Cincinnati, Ohio in 2003. So at that time, I was living in Cincinnati, and the city council there had passed a law that essentially prohibited legal protections for LGBT people. Okay, so this was basically a license to discriminate against LGBT people, I'm gonna need this, in areas like housing, employment, and public accommodations. And so I start here to give you an idea that in 2003, marriage equality was not even part of the agenda. It wasn't on the table. And instead, it was all about non-discrimination laws. And I was working at a law firm at the time, and that firm challenged this law in federal court. And we won at the district court level. We lost at the appellate court level. And then they took it all the way up to the US Supreme Court, and we lost. We didn't lose, they denied the case. So we were stuck with the appellate court decision, and that basically said this anti-gay law was perfectly constitutional. So this all had happened before I got to the firm, and I had come in on the tail end, and I was part of a very small group of attorneys who began meeting to figure out what the heck we were going to do, what our options were. We had exhausted all legal options, and the community was totally devastated. It was a really hard time. And it became very clear that the only way to get this law off the books was to wage a campaign. And we had to put it to the voters, and the voters were the only people who could decide to repeal this law. And the problem was we had no idea how the heck to do that. We did not know, we didn't have the faintest idea of how to run a campaign. So someone in the group called the National Gay and Lesbian Task Force, they came and they essentially taught us how to run a campaign. And the very first lesson was about power. And as attorneys, we had been trained to think about power as something outside of ourselves. We could be powerful, we could make a powerful case, but ultimately the decision makers, the power holders, was the judge or the jury, the government or the system. And the task force folks really began to challenge us in terms of how we thought about power. And they challenged us to think about power as something we could control and something that we could build for ourselves. And this question of power, I think, is one that's really important for all of us to grapple with. And it was our starting place. And I think most of us are really uncomfortable with power because, for good reason, right? Power has been used against us in so many ways. And at the same time, it is also true that if we're interested in social change, that necessarily involves shifting power. And that means we have to get, I think, very serious and clear about our own power, and more importantly, how we build it. And so what I learned in Cincinnati was an equation, and that was that power equals organized people plus organized money. And that was a really powerful way to help me begin to focus on how we build power. And the other thing that that equation provided for me was this idea that power could be quantified. All of a sudden, the relevant questions were, how many people and how much money do I have to put behind my vision? And that was a totally different way of thinking about power for me. And so I just want to start there and ask you to hold that idea, because it's something we're going to circle back to at the end of the story. For now, the story in Cincinnati was that we launched the campaign and we won. And we not only got rid of the anti-gay law, we went on to pass LGBT protections in the areas of housing, unemployment, and public accommodations. And that was a profound shifting point for me in my personal life, because that was the first time that I saw organizing up close and personal. And it was the first time that I was actually part of a campaign that resulted in real and concrete change. And I had never been a part of something like that before. And more importantly than winning, that campaign transformed our community in Cincinnati. We had gone from feeling totally unempowered and devastated to feeling such deep pride in ourselves and in our city, and it was precisely because it was focused on organizing people. We emerged from that campaign not only one, but as a new community with pride and energy and vision. And that was a really significant moment for me, and I ended up leaving my law practice and becoming a full-time organizer. And that is how I got into this work. And my first assignment as a brand new organizer was to go to Maine. I'd never been to Maine before, and my assignment was to work with the local LGBT rights organization called Equality Maine. And I want to tell you something about Maine's history. Maine actually has had more anti-gay ballot measures than any other state in the country, except Oregon. And this is important context for you to understand the eventual campaign. This all started in 1977, where a non-discrimination measure was introduced in the legislature. And at that time, the LGBT community was completely not organized in Maine. And that bill ended up being the impetus for the other side to get organized. And that became a rallying cry for the right wing in Maine. And Maine is not a particularly conservative state, but there was a very organized set of, it was the Christian Coalition. I can't remember what they're called right now, but because they're out of business today, but I'll get to that later. But they used this as their rallying cry. They got organized, and for 28 years, the LGBT community was in a defensive posture, and they were essentially held hostage to this very small but organized group. And it took the LGBT community there almost 3 decades to actually pass a non-discrimination law. And that happened in 2005. And part of why they won in 2005 was because the rest of the country had moved on to marriage. And non-discrimination was no longer controversial. Even the Catholic Church in many, many states was for non-discrimination protections because they too had moved on to marriage. And so Equality Maine was in this place, and they made this decision on the heels of winning non-discrimination, and it was the most important decision they would ever make in their history, and that was to get out of a defensive posture, and they decided they were going to go proactively for marriage. And that was the turning point. And that's where the story gets really interesting. Because once they made this decision, you can imagine the range of reactions in the community. So there was an entire camp of folks who felt like we had just won non-discrimination protections. It took us 28 years. This was too much too soon. And they wanted to put the brakes on. And And then there were other folks in the community who felt like marriage was already taking over the movement, and this was not the most important priority for our community. And it was really, really important. All of these perspectives were really important, and Equality Maine made a decision to spend 3 months and do a series of community conversations around the state. And those conversations were incredibly powerful. For Equality Maine, they understood that marriage was coming to Maine. And the question was whether they were going to continue to be in a defensive posture or they were going to get proactive. And those were very powerful, important conversations. But what was even more, I think, memorable was the conversation around vision and values. And for Equality Maine, they were very clear. They were working for a world without homophobia. And for them, the marriage campaign was the most strategic opportunity in that moment. It was the most strategic vehicle available to them in that movement to get them closer to their vision. And so for them, it wasn't a matter of whether they were going to fight for marriage, but how. How would they create a campaign in service of that larger vision? And I feel like that was a second real lesson for me. The campaign is different than the movement. The campaign, for them, marriage was an end in and of itself, but it also was a vehicle in service of a larger vision. And through that 3-month process of community conversations, they had built enough consensus. It was not the full consensus, but they had built enough consensus for them to begin their work. So I'm going to fast forward to this picture. I think once they had built consensus, they were very clear that their next piece of work was building their team. And when I first started working with Equality Maine, they had 1.5 full-time staff people. They had an executive director and a part-time grants writer. And I share that with you because they were not a powerhouse. They were not starting as a powerhouse organization. And they had enough awareness to understand that before they were going to do this change work out in the world, they needed to build a bigger team. And so those early months I spent doing a lot of work with them, thinking about who their dream team was. Who was their dream team? The question wasn't who should be working on marriage, but who did they really want to work with? Who did they most admire in their community? Who were they most curious about, whether established or up-and-coming leaders? And we literally made a list of those people, and then we started doing one-on-one meetings with them. And I don't know how many of you all identify as organizers in the room, but one-on-one meetings is an organizing technique, right, that you can learn. And we started doing these meetings, and one of the first people I ever did a one-on-one meeting with was this woman on the screen, and her name is Darlene Huntress. And somewhere, to this day I can't remember how Darlene got on my list, but somewhere along the line someone thought that Darlene was someone important that we should talk with. And so Darlene and I met, and it was very clear during my first one-on-one meeting with her that she was very passionate about LGBT rights. And I learned that she was a manager at a local restaurant. And she had been working there 6 years, and she was really burned out on the job. Like, she was done. And I asked her what she loved most about her job throughout all those years, and she said it was the people. She loved the people, and if she could just have the people and let the restaurant go, she was good to go. And I was paying attention to this, as you learn to do, and after a series of conversations, I invited Darlene onto our team, and she was our first full-time organizer. Now, Darlene had no campaign experience, none. But what she had was passion for LGBT rights and passion for people. She connected with people beautifully, and that is what we needed to be part of our team. That is what we needed to build our team. And so for months, I was working and doing these meetings, and then together, Darlene and I were doing these meetings, and the focus was building our team. And I share Darlene's story with you, and she's a very special person. Darlene would go on to work with Equality Maine for 4 years, And then when we launched our official marriage campaign, she ended up serving as the statewide field director for the entire state. And Darlene is a very special person, but there are so many stories like Darlene's. And the point is that our first purpose in building our team, we served the role as talent scouts. That's what we did. And as leaders, our job was to find new leaders. Because as social change movements, we necessarily have to build a bigger team. And that is often the very first step, because there's no way we can operate at the scale that we start with. And so that was our job for months and months as leaders, finding new leaders. And the other thing I want to mention is, Darlene's story, I could give you many more stories, and it was also my own story. I did not start this work with campaign experience. Most of us don't have campaign experience. We haven't grown up in that kind of context. And sometimes you just need to take the leap, and sometimes you search out people and opportunities to learn from. But if we only look for people with this kind of experience, we're never going to build our team. And nor do we need people with this experience. We are looking for leaders in community and finding the best match between what you need and what they have to offer. And that is really the heart of organizing, I think. So we're going to leave Darlene. This is like Darlene's after shot. I don't have a before shot at the restaurant, but I want to fast forward we've built our team, and as we're building our team, we're focusing on writing our plan. And I want to talk a minute about our campaign plan in those early years, and what I like to call the lower C campaign plan. This wasn't the official marriage, capital C campaign, but during this little C, and really in any campaign, the first question is always audience. Who is your audience? Who are the decision makers in your campaign? And for us, it was very clear that we had two audiences. The first was the legislature. To win marriage equality in Maine, we had to pass a marriage equality bill through the legislature, and that meant we needed a pro-LGBT majority. So that was the first audience. But in Maine, like some of your states, including California, it's a ballot measure state. And so if the legislature does something that the voters don't like, they simply can put it on the ballot and force the issue for voters. So we knew we had a second audience in Maine, a second set of decision makers, and that was the voters. And I'll talk more about that later, but ultimately they were going to be the decision makers. And so once we got clear about who our audience was, the next thing we had to get really clear about was our strategy. What is our strategy? And my favorite part of campaigns is the strategy. And I could talk on many levels and in many ways, but at its most basic, our strategy was simply to build a list of pro-LGBT voters. It was that simple. And when I say build a list, there's a couple things build a list of voters, there's a couple things I want to highlight. It wasn't just people. It was voters, right? Voters were our decision makers. So we weren't trying to get the majority of people at the local coffee shop to go for marriage equality. The decision makers in this campaign were voters, and the reality is most people don't vote. And voter lists are public, and that was always our starting place, was the voters. The other thing is really simple, and that is we were building a list of not just names and email addresses. We were building a list with full contact information for every single one of these people that we had a conversation with, because we needed to be able to mobilize them on a dime. And that meant more than email, more than phone number. It also meant making sure we knew exactly where every single one of those folks lived, because we needed to know whose legislative district they lived in. And so we were very clear on building this list, and ultimately in the short term we were going to turn them out to vote for their legislator so we could get a pro-LGBT majority in the legislature, and then ultimately we were going to long-term get them out to vote for the marriage issue itself. So building our team, building our plan. I'm going to fast forward again several years now to 2008. Of course, this was the year of Obama. And we knew in Maine, as in the rest of the country, this was going to be a historic turnout, right? And we imagined, what would it be if we had thousands of conversations with voters across the state of Maine on this single day to talk about marriage equality? And so what we did was build our team, and we ultimately had 350 people spread across Maine at 86 different polling stations. And they asked every single voter as they left what they thought about marriage equality. And if they were supportive, we would have them sign a postcard to their legislature, and we would capture all their contact information. So this was our plan for Election Day, how to take advantage of this historic moment. And we set the most ambitious but realistic goal we could possibly set, and that was we wanted to get 10,000 new pro-LGBT voters identified. And this felt like a huge stretch, but we were determined to do it. And think about it, we could build our list of 10,000 in a single day. That would give us a huge leap forward. And so we had our teams on Election Day, and we had put out 20,000 postcards just to make sure everything was covered. And it was Election Day, we started getting phone calls from our volunteers around noon. And they started telling us that they were running out of postcards. And we couldn't figure out what had gone wrong. We're like, we had 20,000 out there, what happened to the postcards? And then we started getting calls from all different parts of the state saying the same thing. They were running out of postcards. So we started scrambling, and all of our postcards were blue, and everybody needed blue postcards. We said, forget it, go to Kinko's, we'll go white postcards. And we just needed to get more and more postcards out. And by 1 o'clock, we had surpassed our goal of 10,000. And by the end of that Election Day, we had identified 33,000 pro-LGBT voters in a single day. It was amazing. I could not believe it. I was actually not on the ground. I was in Florida. I was working for the Obama campaign. They'd shipped everybody out of Chicago. I was in Florida, and I was not even believing the calls. Like, I was third hand, and I couldn't believe it. Our team was doing awesome, and they were having the best experience, right? We had trained this team to, prepare for all of this anti-gay onslaught at the booths, right? And instead, people were going out of their way to sign these postcards. And what an amazing experience for them as individuals to see the support in their community. And then as a community overall, statewide, we did a call that night. I was calling from Florida, and to count 33,000, it completely shifted the sense of possibility. Completely shifted. Now, on that day, we not only did that, but we elected Obama, of course, but we also elected a pro-LGBT majority in the Maine legislature. And for the first time in Maine's history, we had a pro-LGBT House, Senate, and a pro-LGBT governor. And all of these things combined, we knew that 2009 was our year. This was our window of opportunity. It was amazing. I'm going to fast forward now to March of 2009. By then, we had introduced our bill to the legislature, and we had begun the process. Our first hurdle was getting co-sponsors. And we had picked up all of the low-hanging fruit, and they were all Democrats. And we desperately wanted a Republican. We wanted to avoid as much as possible this being a partisan issue. And we had several Republican targets in the legislature, and one of them was this state representative named Meredith Strang-Burgess. And our lobbyists were all over her. And the conversations with her went something like how they went with everybody else. I have nothing wrong with gay marriage, she would tell us, and they use that language, of course. But my constituents would never support it, and therefore I can't support it. And so our lobbyist had one of these conversations this one Thursday morning, and then she called me, and she said, we really need to turn the heat up on Strang-Burgess. And so we went into organizing mode. We pulled out all of the postcards that we had collected from Strang-Burgess's district the prior election. We pulled in 10 of our volunteers, and we put them on the phone, They called every single one of those constituents in Strang Burgess's district. And by the end of the night, we had 160 calls into Strang Burgess. And they were urging her not only to vote in favor of the marriage bill, but to be a co-sponsor. The next morning, literally the next morning, our lobbyists sought down Strang Burgess, and we had her. She agreed to be a co-sponsor. And this was so important for us because it was the first time that we actually mobilized our people. We showed our power. We demonstrated the power that we had built. And we were able to mobilize them on a dime. And Strang Burgess knew that we had her back. And we were able to give her the political cover to do the right thing. And that was such an important lesson for all of us in terms of the ability to mobilize on a dime. And that's the difference between having a list versus having a list that you can mobilize. And that's real power. So I'm going to fast forward to April 22nd, 2009. By this point, all of our co-sponsors are secured. Strang Burgess was our one and only Republican, but we had her. And the rest of the legislature was refusing to take a public position on the bill until after the public hearing. And in, I think, all states, most states, including Maine, a bill has to have a public hearing. And this is simply where people come to testify for and against the bill, right? And in Maine, if you have 12 people show up for a public hearing, it's a crowd, okay? This might be true in your state, those of you who do legislative work. But we were determined that the public hearing was going to be our pivot point. We chose that moment. And we were determined we were going to have the biggest turnout ever. And our most important goal was we wanted to outnumber the opposition 2-1. That was our goal. So we started organizing, and as the day was approaching, the legislature decided to take the public hearing out of the state legislative, the state house, and move it to a local high school auditorium, because they were getting a lot of inquiries. A lot of interest was being generated. And then 3 days before the hearing, they moved it again, and this time it was to the State Civic Center. And this is where the circus comes, and the rock bands, to give you a sense of the scale. And so, with each move, we contacted our people, and when the day came, the public hearing, more than 3,000 people showed up to our public hearing. And I'm going to get emotional on this, because this was like the best day of my life. And more than 3,000 people packed up their families, took the day off of work, drove the hours to Augusta, Maine is a big state, and showed up to testify for this bill. We gave 11 hours of testimony on this bill. And we outnumbered the opposition not 2-1, but 3-1. And the best part about this whole story is that we had asked our supporters to wear red. And it was on a whim. This wasn't even like a brilliant thing. We're like, hey, why don't we have our supporters wear red? And I will never, ever forget the day of walking into the Civic Center and looking up and seeing a sea of red. It was amazing. And it was the first time for most of us in our lives that we were the visible majority. And there are people who I had known for years and years who were walking around different on that day. They were different in their bodies. And it was that moment where there was no longer hesitancy. There was no longer the feeling of this was too much too soon. And we knew that it wasn't a question of if, but when. And that happened on an individual level, but it happened on a community level. That was our common shared experience. And from there was no going back. So I want to fast forward and talk about the final legislative vote. We eventually did win in the legislature. And Maine went from being one of the states with the most anti-gay ballot measures in the country to being the first state in the nation to pass a marriage equality bill and have it signed by the governor. And we did that within 4 years, to give you a sense of the time. And the thing I want to impart to you is that it was so much fun. We had so much fun. And I said that I'm a strategy person, and I love especially like getting into the details about the strategy. And for me, this is where the fun is. And I just want to share with you what we did with those postcards. We had intentionally held back all of those postcards. We had been collecting them for a very long time, months, even more than a year. But we never sent them in because, again, we had chosen the public hearing was going to be our moment of pivot. And so we wanted to start releasing them only after the public hearing because we wanted to create this sense of inevitability. And so we took all of the postcards, we divided them by legislative districts, and we decided, we knew when the final vote was going to happen, and we decided to release them week by week by week. And in the beginning, we wanted to make sure that with each week, they were increasing in numbers. So in the first week, we would send 100 postcards. The second week, we would double that number. The third week, we would triple it. And by the end, each legislator was getting thousands of postcards. We had the postcards the whole time, but we were creating this impression, this perception of increasing momentum, increasing support. And that was awesome. The other thing we did was we would put a letter with each bundle of postcards. So we had both quantity and quality, and in the letter we would highlight one story in depth of why marriage mattered for LGBT families in Maine. The other thing we did when we couldn't always do this. Maine is a small place. It's a big state, but not a lot of people. And everyone knows everyone else. And in the beginning, we started sending these postcards to the home addresses of these legislators. And where we could, we would pull out the postcards from all their neighbors and we put them on top. And this gave them the opportunity to go through the postcards in the privacy of their own home. And every single one of those postcards was from their constituent, i.e. the people who were going to decide whether or not to re-elect them. The other thing we did was we shifted towards the end, and instead of sending them to their home addresses, we started hand-delivering them to the State House. And all of a sudden, the State House was flooded with blue postcards. And in Maine, they don't have offices. Their desk is where all of their work is. And if you go and look over everyone's desk from the balcony, blue everywhere, Republicans and Democrats alike. And the opposition got wind of this. They started their own postcard campaign. It was yellow. It was a little late in the game. And they had, I don't know how many postcards, but the difference was they sent the same stack of postcards, the same people, to every single legislator. And it was meaningless because those were not the people who lived in their district. So this is where the fun happens. It really was so much fun to really strategize and think about how we not only build the power, but you mobilize in this strategic way to build momentum. And so this picture is taken from the day of the final vote, and this is happening in the State House, and this is Jim and Steve. And I chose this picture specifically because Jim and Steve were also one of the very first one-on-one meetings that I ever have when I started working in Maine. And both of them are native Mainers. And over the course of those 4 years, they went on to be the most incredible community leaders. And they never had any campaign experience. And it was the most perfect moment for me to have the news media pull those two people aside as a couple to talk about and to represent what this was all about, not just in terms of their desire to get married, but in terms of the transformation that was happening in this community through this people-powered campaign. So I love this picture. So now I fast forward to summer in Maine. And the opposition spent the summer gathering signatures to place this issue on the ballot. And the rest of the community, the LGBT community and allies in Maine, really was looking to take the summer off. They had rearranged their lives to make this issue a priority. They had worked their tails off for the last 6 months, and they felt like they needed a break. After all, we had just won, right? Those of us inside the campaign knew that November was around the corner, and our audience was no longer the legislature, it was voters. There's a lot more voters than there are legislators. And so we were in this moment when there was a profound lack of urgency in the community, and understandably so. But inside the campaign, we were never more aware of the need for organized people and organized money, because we needed to take this thing to a whole new level. So we really struggled through the summer, and it became very clear to us that we needed to think on a different level. And so we started thinking about organizing at the national level. How were we going in this moment of needing to go to the next level? How are we going to build our team even bigger? And so we went to the Netroots Nation conference. I don't know if you all know what it is. It's an annual conference, and it's for people working in politics and media. And we went to that conference. We brought all of our best people, and we took over the conference in the best possible way. And we wanted our campaign everywhere, because this was going to be our ticket to getting to a national audience, more so than what we were capable of prior. And at that conference, we formed the national blog team for Maine. And on that team, we had some very prominent national bloggers, both in the progressive community, not just in the LGBT community, but in the progressive community at large. And that was really significant for us. That was a game changer. Through that work, we ended up building an email list that was 10 times bigger than the one we started with. And using that email list, we eventually raised $1.9 million. The other thing that we did was we created a program called the Volunteer Vacation Program. And through that program, we had more than 100 people, organizers from around the country, come to Maine and spend a week or longer being a full-time, unpaid volunteer for the campaign. And in exchange, what they got was community housing and a hands-on training for what it was like to do organizing in this amazing campaign. In the end, we had 122 people pay their way to come to Maine and work with us. So now I want to fast forward to the night before the election. At this point, the official campaign has been running for almost a year, right? Starting in the legislative campaign, moving to the ballot measure. And of course, that doesn't count the 4 years prior that it took to build our team and build our list. And from the very beginning of that work, we were focused on building our base and building our team. And I want to give you a sense of the scale, what we were able to grow to. I told you Equality Maine started as 1.5 full-time people. And by the end of this journey, well, let me also say, by the beginning of the official campaign, we started with 8 organizers. We had raised enough money to hire 8 organizers. And by November, we had grown to 65 paid staff around the state in 1 year. That was powerful, but I want to emphasize, this is the important part, not how great that is, but that was the scale we needed to be operating at in order to win. That's the important part of that. We also had more than 8,000 active volunteers, including the volunteer vacationers from around the country. And together, this team of staff and volunteers built a list of more than 100,000 pro-LGBT voters that we turned out to vote in this election. And the important part of that is that list isn't going anywhere. That is the list that we turned out in that election and in every election since that was important to our community. That's part of what is built through people-centered campaigns. So through a lot of hard work, we organized our people. Not only that, we organized our money. We organized our dollars. By the end of our campaign, we had more than 24,000 individual donors. And just to give you a sense of scale, our opposition, who raised almost as much money as we did, had 750. So our campaign was not funded by a couple single donors. The vast majority of our donors gave between $1 and $50. 72% of our donors gave between $1 and $50. And that just gives you a sense of both the possibility of fundraising, but also think about the potential going forward. Any fundraiser will tell you the hardest money to raise is the first time. And all of a sudden, Maine had 24,000 pro-LGBT donors to build from in the coming years. I think at this point, I just want to return to this idea of social change equals organized people plus organized money. And I think this is something maybe we can return to in our conversation, but this is what we did in Maine. And this is honestly how I continue to think about my work to this day, including my work on ending child sexual abuse. This is how I think about movement building. The most important thing I want to highlight on this election eve is, more than any of that, what we were most proud of is that we built a campaign that was connected to our larger vision. We had built a campaign that embodied the values that were the most important thing to us and that we were grounded in from the beginning. We created opportunities for everyday people to come into this campaign. We offered them opportunities to live out their values, and we offered opportunities for them to really own this campaign in a way that we did not own it. It was theirs. So finally, election day comes, as it always does. In 2009, Maine had the highest voter turnout of any year, of any non-presidential election year. That meant people came out of the woodwork, and they did, both for and against this issue. And that night, after we did our work, we all gathered at the Holiday Inn in Portland. We were all in the grand ballroom, and we watched the election results come in. And it was standing room only. There were 2,000 of us together in this room, and there was so much love in that room, and we felt so connected. It truly felt connected as a family. And as the results started coming in, we would watch it on the TV screens. And it was, there was a range of emotions. Some towns came in, and it was great news, and we all would cheer, right? And other towns came in, and it wasn't so good news. And Maine is a huge state, not a lot of people. The other thing is it's very slow in Maine. And it was a very long night, very long night. The results came in very slowly. And by the middle of the night, there were still several hundred people in the room. And when they called the election, the final tally was 48 our side, 58% their side. And it was really hard. It was a really, really hard moment. But I want to tell you about this experience because I was in the room surrounded by literally, it's the middle of the night and there are several hundred people still there. And I remember watching on the TV screen the news broadcast of the opposition. And the campaign manager, they were at the headquarters, and the campaign manager was giving his victory speech. And on the stage with him was less than a dozen people. And I remember watching him, and at one point, the news cameras panned out to the audience, and there was no one in the audience. And he was literally talking to no one except the cameras. And I remember feeling such deep pride in what we had built. For us, this was not about a campaign. This was about building a movement. And there was evidence of that movement all around me in that moment. And I truly felt the power that this movement is going to outlast the very few remaining of those on the other side. And that was the feeling I had on election night. And so I want to introduce you to the movement in Maine. These are people, Darlene's parents are somewhere in here, who were part of the movement in 2009 and are part of the movement also today as Maine goes back to the ballot this year and will vote once and for all in favor of marriage equality this November. And so these are the people that together came to build this movement and are continuing. And with that, I will close and thank you all for listening, and really want to open it up to you all for reactions, comments, questions, and I would love to have a discussion from here.
So that's a very powerful and heartbreaking story at the same time. Minnesota also has a ballot initiative this year. And so there's lots of lessons to be learned for us. There's a lot of organizing going on in Minnesota, campaigning for the public's heart. And so I don't really have a question. I really thank you for sharing that story, because it's to me it speaks to the strength of hope, which we can never give up.
Thanks.
I think it's so true what you said about that you were building a movement and that the campaign was a part of that towards building a movement. But then after the loss, the campaign loss, how did you sustain? It's obvious you did build a movement, you know, the 700 people that were still in the room and carrying on. What did you do, or what were your next steps to like sustain that and keep moving?
Yeah, great question. So many ways to answer that. I'll choose two. The next morning we all got together. Truly, we got together on the City Hall steps in Portland. And there were, I don't know how many people, easily 1,000, who got together. And of course, you know, more than 10 people get together and the news is there in Maine. So, and so we had a press conference, and we wanted to, there's actually footage of this online, but we wanted to be very clear that we were very proud, that we weren't going away, and that we were pressing on. So that was both, like, we needed each other and we needed to be together, and we made very, you know, so that was immediate the next day. But we also did a series of community conversations the month after. So in December, Equality Maine really began its campaign again in the same way that it had started, truly. And we did community conversations around the state so that people could be together. The other way I'll answer that, though, is, you know, I'll put my campaign manager hat on, and that's much more about strategy, right? So we looked at the numbers. We pored over the numbers, right? And there's no question that we lost. We knew we were going to lose in rural communities, right? But we lost by too much. And so literally the first money I raised after the campaign was $500,000 from the Gill Foundation, or excuse me, Gill Action, and they funded a rural organizing project in Maine, coming off of the heels of that loss. And they get it. And so that's how we started building again. We took care of ourselves, but it goes back to strategy, clear thinking. Who is our audience? So yeah.
Your thinking question, so I feel like this is a chance to pick your brain. Because when you sent out the 10,000 cards, I'm just imagining as an administrator in my other life, going and getting 33,000 and wondering who is putting this in a database.
Totally.
And where are we going to sit them? And just that, administrative capacity to grow to 65 and have that HR. I mean, the may think too small, but the reality of the administrative piece of it.
Huge.
Yeah, bottlenecks us all the time.
So we ended up getting all of the computers from the Maine Democratic Party donated to us on a temporary basis. And we set up shop in the Equality Maine office. We had 20 computers. And we just had teams of people coming in, and Cody was running them, training them how to enter the database. And we put everything into the database, and that's how we began. And we had a data team all the way through the end of Election Day. And that was how it got started. It is important to plan ahead. Sometimes you can't do it. And those are good problems to have. They're real problems, and we need to think about how we solve them. But good problem to have. And for me, most of the time, it always goes back to building a bigger team.
So first I want to thank you. It's an amazing story and an amazing perspective too. And also I'm taking down notes of all of these like small strategies that you're already giving us. Like they're so valuable. Before you were talking about this conversation or this tension within the movement about the issue of marriage taking over the movement is what you were saying before. So I'm wondering, what is the direction now? Like, who's part of this conversation? And like, if you can just explore that a little bit.
I just want to make sure I understand your question. So like in the campaign now?
Yes.
So what does it look like now?
What does it look like now? And then also, what does it look like now? And I was wondering if you could explore more that statement that you had made earlier about marriage as an issue taking over the broader movement.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. So great question. So some of you may pay attention to this more than others, but there's a lot of tension in the LGBT movement around the amount of resources and attention and focus that marriage gets. A lot of folks, and I'm one of them, feel like the fact that transgender people still are harassed and discriminated against and physically attacked at levels that are unbelievable. So the question is posed, what is the movement doing about that? What is the movement doing about homeless youth? On and on. And these are very live debates that happen every day through today and happened then. And I think what we did in Maine was not be afraid to have those conversations. I think that's like the biggest thing. We have to find a way to have difficult conversations within our movements, because most of the time we just avoid. And so the marriage folks go in their camp and the homeless youth folks go in their camp, and everybody thinks that's the priority. We were not afraid to have those conversations in Maine, and we didn't land in a place of consensus. But we had sent the message that we were open and that we were working in service of a larger vision that held all of us. And we had many folks who chose not to rearrange their life to make marriage a priority, but they were cheering from the sidelines. And I think my biggest lesson learned was not to be afraid to have the conversation. We must have the conversation. Otherwise, we continually undercut our own power. Because then the power goes in, all of our power gets into trying to make the argument of what's more important. And most of the time, we actually even avoid that conflict, I think. And I think we have to, if we're going to move forward, whether it's in the LGBT movement or any movement, we cannot be afraid to be in conflict. And we have to know that that is part of the work. And we can do that respectfully. And we can do that in a way that we stay in relationship with each other, even if we are not both, rearranging our life to make X a priority. Can I say one other thing? Your question makes me think a lot about the differences between my work then and my work now. So, and these are just observations I have. Folks will have other observations, but the LGBT movement is pretty male-dominated. And it's not conflict avoidant, for the most part. In some cases where, it's overly conflict, don't handle conflict well. But people, I found, this is just me, in the LGBT movement weren't afraid to step into their own power, weren't afraid to assert their position, ideas, vision, priorities, strategy, ideas. And the work I do now, I work around ending child sexual abuse, and we're so much more polite. We're so nice. And we have so much emphasis on the relationship. And my opinion is that gets in our way. We are afraid to have the hard conversations. We don't know what it's like to be in conflict and still be in relationship. But I would argue for social change to happen, we must learn to do that because we need to start making choices. And inherent in making choices is making priority decisions, and that causes conflict. And I would say in the violence against women's movement, and I would love to hear your perspectives on this is just mine, I feel like it's really hard for us to be in conflict with each other. And I would argue that that has held us back. And that is why maybe we're not as far along as we would like.
Also just want to echo, thank you so much for sharing that story and for just the tremendous role that you have played and continue to play. It's very inspiring to hear, I think, for all of us, so incredibly powerful. I was wondering if you could talk a little bit about the messaging for the campaign, kind of how that was developed and what that looked like over the arc of the campaign.
Great, yeah. So, I'd like to answer that question by giving a little perspective on history, because over all of these years, I think I stopped counting, but at last count 16 different campaigns. And a lot of these were really early on, like 2003, 2004, 2005. And at that time, again, this is me speaking, this might be controversial, but I think, in the LGBT movement, we ran closeted campaigns back in the day. And I don't say that to criticize, I say that because just to highlight how difficult these decisions are, these strategy decisions, especially around messaging, right? Because that's our face. And I say we ran closeted campaigns because for years, we would run LGBT campaigns, we'd never even use the word gay. Literally. We would not have gay and lesbian people, let alone gay and lesbian couples, in our ads speaking on behalf of the campaign. And I want to make this real because the reality is we're trying to win a campaign. We're trying to move forward. We do public polling, and guess what? It comes back and says people are homophobic, right? People don't believe in gay marriage. People don't think gay and lesbian couples should be raising kids. So what are you to do, right? So these are very real challenges. These are not easy answers. And I guess I just had lived in too many closeted campaigns, and we lost every one of them. So it got to the point where we had to say, at least we're going to lose forward. Yeah. At least we are going to run a campaign in service of that larger vision, and even if we lose, we have moved the ball forward. And So in the end, you know, we were the first campaign in the country to have gay and lesbian couples talking about marriage. Even in California, they did not have couples. They had a single gay person talking about their partner, and most often about something terrible that happened to their partner, right? Because this is it happens. In Maine, we did a lot of messaging work, as all campaigns do, and we really worked hard to not only put our community forward, but also do it in a way that was really about love and community and freedom and, you know, fighting for something, right? It was something positive, it was a positive frame. The other thing I'll say, though, it wasn't, with messaging, it gets tricky because messaging is not for us, right? It's not for those of us who are already converted. And so, yeah, I'd love to run a campaign that said, you know, it's all about ending homophobia, right? And, you know, that was our vision, but we had to get curious enough about how other people thought and what was a leap that wasn't too far. And so ultimately, there's many people, even in our own community, that criticized our messaging, right? There was an emphasis on commitment. Well, what about non-monogamous folks, right? What about people who, you know, and I feel that. But in the end, I think social change is about living in the, if we are interested in social change work, we have to commit to living in the in-between, meaning not around people who think just like us. And obviously, we don't want to go all the way over there. But we have to live in the middle and be curious enough about what is it we can say and do to bring these folks closer to us. And I think that's a lot of, a big challenge for folks, because we want to stay in our own comfort level, our own comfort zone. So I hope that's helpful.
Thank you, Monique. I really appreciate you being here and sharing the story. And I love what you just said about the messaging and how you really had to think about how do you bridge that message so that it resonates with others. After you lost, and you said you regrouped and how important that was, because you had amassed all of these individuals who were working on behalf of this effort. Did you have to regroup with voters? I mean, because sometimes when there's a loss, people just feel that sense of, well, it's not going to happen, it didn't happen. So while all of you were trying to re-energize, or you did re-energize, did you have to do any rebuilding in the community, or was everybody just ready for the next step?
Yeah, so Patty, let me just make sure I understand your question. Are you talking about more in terms of our community or the voters, or both?
Both, actually.
Okay.
That would be great.
So I think within the community, people were tired. There's no question. People were tired. And so, you know, people were not, you know, they may have been saying, when's the next campaign? But the reality was they had their lives that they needed to sort of regroup. And so we did a lot of work in rural communities. In the 6 months to year, I mean, it continues, but we focused on rural communities. And we hadn't done enough work in those communities, and they, frankly, were happy to have us. You know, that campaign, people came out for the first time in these rural communities. And, you know, it was a different way of organizing. I mean, the very first thing we did in these communities was we called up everyone who was in our database who lived in those communities, and we asked them if they would put their name on an ad in the local paper. And so we just wanted to keep up the visibility, particularly in those communities, because people risked a lot to come out for the first time. And so it was particularly important in that moment, not just from a strategic perspective, but also to keep everybody's, you know, hope up, right? Like, and so we did a lot of work in those communities. In terms of voters, I guess I would say the good thing about LGBT rights, especially around marriage, once you have somebody, you have them. I mean, every poll will tell you that. Like, there is no slippage. Like, once people come to see marriage equality, we don't lose them. The question for us in this part of our campaign, of our movement, is it's all about persuasion. Like, how do we get those people who either didn't turn out to vote, which was very small, but how do we get those people who were on the fence? How do we actually invite them on the journey to move from there to here? And that's why, I don't know what you all thought about President Obama, right? But, there's lots of things to be said about his coming out, right? But what I found so powerful is he modeled the journey story. And that is exactly where we are in this movement. We have to create a place where those who were not with us can come over with us. Because we're almost there. I mean, you all see the polls. We're almost there. And we just need a little more. I mean, it will happen, but we want it to happen now. And so it's the journey story that we're really focused on with voters right now.
I'm not exactly sure how to ask this question except to kind of do it bluntly, and
Go for it.
please don't take it the wrong way. But like, how does marriage equality create a world without homophobia?
What this campaign did was invite almost, I think, literally every single person in the state of Maine to grapple with this question of LGBT humanity. It invited people into a conversation at every level, in schools, in churches, at the dinner tables, at the water cooler. And those conversations is what changes and ends homophobia. Those conversations would have never happened had there not been a campaign. There would have been no reason. When you pick up the paper and you're reading about the latest gay marriage blah-de-blah in Maine that just happened, chances are you're going to turn to your, kid or partner or whomever, or talk about it with your neighbor. And that's how the conversations get going. We forced the conversation. It was a vehicle for those conversations. And in that way, people came out for the first time. People took the next step. And for me, I believe that after these campaigns around marriage, people begin to see LGBT people in their full humanity, right? It isn't just an LGBT person and we think about, I don't know what they think, like sex or, like it's a one-dimensional kind of thing. All of a sudden, they met us and our partner and our kids and our parents. And, and so I feel like it's just one layer of the onion off. And those conversations could have happened through many other vehicles. But marriage was the conversation of the day. And that was largely not due to us. That was actually due to the right wing, who used these ballot measures to get out their base, starting in 2004. So, for me, it wasn't about marriage, but for me, it was like there was no question we have to do it, because it was already happening. The question was whether we were going to be part of the conversation or not. And then the question was, how do we have the conversation so that it isn't just about a single set of rights, but that we are really running campaigns in service of that larger vision?
Thank you. It's been really inspiring, and I've learned a lot. I'm thinking about the intersectionality of your current role and the past campaigns you've worked on as a strategy. And so I'm thinking right now, with a lot of the work that we do with boys and young men, specifically those who aren't a part of a movement, who aren't focused on preventing men's violence against women and girls. I'm thinking about seizing a moment and not being polite. Today there was the jury trials for Jerry Sandusky, the coach for Penn State. And just if you have any thoughts or comments in your current role or background around how you would seize that or use that as an opportunity to invite men in to have this conversation around their love of sports or football, or what strategy might you employ to use this moment?
Yeah, well, I think it's already happening. I mean, it is amazing the conversations that are happening on child sexual abuse in male spaces, right? The sports page, we did this analysis of all the media coverage on the Sandusky. It all happened in the sports section. In the same way as that was a horrible vehicle to start the conversation, all of a sudden it was happening among boys and men. in a really profound way. So I think as movement leaders, as movement builders, it is up to us to constantly be scanning the horizon for those moments and choosing them actively to say, okay, how do we then take this conversation and have the conversation we want to have, instead of the conversation that is playing out on some of the sports pages. Yeah. Yeah. Can I just say thank you? It is a privilege to be able to have these conversations with you all, and I've had a lot of love for you from afar, knowing that this was happening and that this precious cohort and this precious project has come to fruition. And so I just really want to thank you for being so welcoming to me, and just a lot of love to you all.